Μια μεγάλη ευχαριστία και από μένα.
A big thanks on my part as well. Thank you for being here tonight. I will use the Greek language for a while and then I'm going to revert in English because I'm going to have a discussion with Mr. Mendelsohn in English. And I know that many of us are watching us through the internet and I'm sure that you know who Daniel Mendelsohn is. And then again, I guess you are also Cavafy plans. More than again, I guess you know that what you're about to witness is a discussion on the poet, the relationship of Cavafy with us and others. And we're going to talk about the role of Cavafy poetry in our own lives. And in due course, we're going to talk about the literature, history, the cultural, ethnic, and erotic identity of translation poetry. Just like you heard before, this is yet another event that is being hosted by the Ωνάση Foundation on the occasion of the Cavafy year. And then again, the acquisition of the relevant records and files from the foundation. This Cavafy cycle aims at bringing the poet to the forefront along with his work and his historical and literary mark. It's multitudinous readings, not just by experts and specialists, but by lay people around the globe, since many of us have related with such poetry. And so it is for this big poet of time, of lust, of desire, of loss in the world, we are going to have a discussion today. And it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be joined on stage by Daniel Mendelsohn. He is a man that has influenced many of us, especially the young researchers and scholars, people that are trying to somehow connect our academic background and our interests and hobbies with our publications and public articles. Daniel Mendelsohn is one of these people that teaches people how to bring together proper reading and translation, philology, and everyday life. And at least this is how I perceive Daniel Mendelsohn, and he's also influenced me in that sense. You heard about his work in Cavafy. He's been working in Cavafy for a number of years. You have been impressed by the outcome of Mendelsohn's work. And moreover, I've been impressed due to the fact that this is something that shows a certain sense of intensity and tension that's always beyond me. I remember when I first read the translated poems that were published in magazines and journals, and I found out back then that he was about to publish more poems, and then I read more poems, and I knew about the forthcoming publication of all the Cavafy poems, including the incomplete ones, unfinished ones, that is. And quite often, Daniel Mendelsohn refers to Cavafy in his work. It's as if Daniel Mendelsohn is a poet that keeps going back and coming back to Cavafy. So this is where I would like to start from. And on that point, let me revert in English.
You understood that it seems to me that Cavafy for you is a poet, not a poet that you once turned to or a poet that you once translated, but a poet that you like to return to. And for many of us, it's been such a significant poet as well. Mm-hmm. I'm asking both a personal and a more general question. Why Cavafy? Why Cavafy?
Why Cavafy? I think, to my mind, Cavafy is a necessary poet. I think on two levels. I don't say this of every poet, but I think there are some poets who are necessary poets. I think to read Cavafy, to be intimate with Cavafy, is to enhance the inner life in a personal way. No poet that I can think of in any language that I know of is as interested in, I would say, the effect of time and one's relationship to time in the course of one's own life. And for the same reason, I think that Cavafy is a necessary poet on a larger level. I will do my very best to avoid saying the national level, but on a cultural level, I would say that the same preoccupation with time, with the perspective that time gives to a person or a nation or a culture, allows us to think about our own experience as members of a civilization in a very meaningful way. I will add to that the obvious observation that I am an American experiencing Cavafy. I think that doesn't prevent me from experiencing Cavafy in a deep way, but there are obvious ramifications of what I just said as a poet who's interested in time and culture, specifically for Greeks. And I know that we will come to that subject shortly. But to me, the answer to why Cavafy, as I say, is nobody thinks harder about the way we relate to the passage of our own lives than Cavafy does. And that has implications both, I would say, personal and psychological on the one hand, and cultural and civilizational, if there is such a word, on the other. And there are many other poets that I love, but I think that Cavafy is very important in a way that even those poets are not so important.
It's interesting, isn't it? There is a Greek critic who has once said that every single period, every time, reads Cavafy as if it is their own, as if it is a contemporary poet. So the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 70s, the year 2000, read Cavafy as if it is a poet writing now.
Well, because, Cavafy can be read by every era as if he were writing both for and about that era, because that is his subject, right? That is precisely his subject, which is both everything changes and everything remains the same, right? This is what he sees over and over again in the passage of time, in the passage of the time of one's own life, but also in the passage of the time of the lives of entire nations. Because, it is, I think I can safely say, it will never be the case that there will come an era in the history of humankind in which Cavafy turns out to be wrong, right?
And is this because he was clever enough to avoid taking sides, or?
Well, I always sort of make the same joke, which is that history is really the study of human nature, and people never change. So that's something that he understands.
And, okay, I can see why an American intellectual and a critic at that is fascinated by Cavafy. I can see it in your example. But how come an American boy finds Cavafy suddenly? I understand you first read Cavafy a long time ago, and that was always my question. How come you found Cavafy out? How come Cavafy found you? I don't know.
Well, there's a funny story behind this. I found Cavafy twice. I read Cavafy in college. I should say, first of all, that to Americans, I think Cavafy is an important poet. I think people tend to know one Greek literary figure in the United States, and that will be Cavafy. Partly it's because of Ithaki, but not totally because of Ithaki. So I think probably at university I read some poems. Certainly Perimenodas τους Βάρβαρους, because I was already a classics major in university. So you think, oh my gosh, there's this Greek guy and he's writing poems about the ancient world. How wonderful is that, But then, I don't know, it didn't sort of get to me until much later. And then what happened is Cavafy and I found each other in a very peculiar way much later. You've heard this story.
This doesn't mean that I don't want the others to hear it.
But
it's a great story.
In the late 1980s, I was a graduate student in classics, and I was doing the program at the Amerikanικός Σχολείο up in Kolonaki. And this is the period in my life when I realized I had no interest whatsoever in being an archaeologist. And because every morning you wake up at 4 in the morning and you have to climb to the top of a mountain to look at a Mycenaean beehive tomb. And they all look exactly the same. And so I had only brought a couple of books with me, which I read over and over. And at a certain point, I started to have intellectual starvation. And we were driving across the Peloponnesos in a bus, and we all got off in Tripolis to make a pee-pee stop. And I went into like a Pantopolion or something desperately, and I said to the guy, I said, I have got to get a book, any book. I don't care what it is, a comic book even, because I'm going to go mad if I have to look at one more broken pot. And the only book that he had was Cavafy's. And he gave it to me. He wouldn't let me give him money. I remember it was an old copy of Cavafy's. And I started then, I didn't even know Greek, really. I had just started to learn a little bit of Greek. And I started memorizing one poem every day, just to keep my mind from dying, basically. And that's how we found each other. As I always like to say, he may not saved my life, but he certainly saved my brain. And so it became sort of part of my mental furniture at a very crucial moment, I think. And then that was it. Then what happened is I was studying, so then I decided I wanted to really learn Greek while I was at graduate school, and there was a wonderful, wonderful professor I had at Princeton, where I was a graduate student, called Richard Burgi. And he, being old-fashioned, made us memorize poems as we were learning Greek. So imagine, we were in the first week of Greek. Nobody even knew how to say Kalimerasas. And we were memorizing Cavafy also. So there were sort of funny moments in my life when Cavafy kept coming up. But by then, I think I had the correct mental apparatus to appreciate Cavafy. By the time I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I think Cavafy is a poet for grown-ups. And you have to be grown up to appreciate it, I would say. So I think at a certain point, I was ready for Cavafy by that point.
Why do we do that? Why would someone want to find a book to save their mind from going crazy?
Well, it was interesting because, many kids who fall in love with ancient Greece, you're an American kid, and so why do you fall in love with ancient Greek? Naked statues and dirty stories. It's like, gosh, our God is so well behaved, Look at the fun they had. I was, at a very early age, interested in ancient Greece and mythology, and I thought archaeology, everybody wants to find a tomb. But I realized on this American school program that objects were not so interesting to me. But then I had 9 weeks where all you did is look at objects. And I thought, I had this sort of revelation. I thought, oh, I'm a text person, not an object person. And it was funny that I went that long without realizing that, but I wanted text. That's what I wanted.
I'm saying this because often I'm trying to find out why Cavafy exerts that influence and is liked so much by students. Every time you go into a class and you throw a text to students, they are fascinated. And one of the things that he's a poet who makes you think constantly and invest time, energy, feeling in interpreting, in reading and reading again. And to my mind, this is an important function of literature. Not only an aesthetic function, but also keeping you interested, alive, awake, invested. in a piece of text. And also, it's interesting that we always think of Cavafy as reworking his texts, picking them, putting them together, preparing them for publication, changing them after they were published, republishing. And somehow it replicates that relationship we want to have with a book or with a text. I don't know if you agree with that. Is that the reason he keeps being so fascinating to people?
Yes, I think Cavafy is fascinating to people in a way that's quite different from the way that other poets are. It's a very hard quality to describe, you know. And here I hate to quote the famous, you know, E.M. Forster description, standing at an angle to the universe, and yet there's a great wisdom in there. You know, Cavafy, I don't know about angle, but there's a sense of Cavafy that one responds to very strongly, which is that he's looking at everything not in the same way that anybody else is looking at everything. Now, of course, every poet is like that. But Cavafy, you know, Cavafy liked the shady corners. Geographically, he likes places, you know, when you study the classics, as I did, you know, most people are interested essentially in two places, Athens and Rome. What's so interesting about Cavafy when you first discover him is how interested he is in every other place in antiquity. Antioch, you know, obviously Alexandria, the sort of funny places where Greek culture ended up thriving, you know. So there's a sort of geographic strangeness, right? He reminds you that Greek culture was happening everywhere, not just in Athens, not even just Alexandria, Libya, funny places. Temporally, I would say, and again, I'm saying as a person with a perspective with a typical classical education, he's interested in sort of everything but the classical period. When I went to graduate school, I was essentially a literature person, but we had to take an examination in ancient history. And I remember one of the older graduate students telling me, "Don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the Hellenistic period." He said, because they all have the same names and nobody can keep them straight. And you know, it's so interesting that, of course, that's the period that Cavafy is interested in, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, what we call late antiquity now, which wasn't even a sort of business when I was in graduate school. It wasn't even something people were interested in. The 5th century, the 6th century AD, of course, Byzantium. And if you're an Anglophone reader, you have the terrible problem that is the inheritance from Gibbon, which is, the English way of looking at Byzantium, which is, oh, too bad, there was this 1,000-year period which we're just going to ignore. So, and of course, Cavafy is obsessed with Byzantium. So one could say historically or chronologically or temporally, he's interested in what nobody else was interested in, And then, of course, we come inevitably to the subject of Eros, right? As a homosexual person living in a city which was then sort of on the edge of the European experience, he's going to have another way in which his perspective is different from everybody else's perspective. So I think all of these things layer on top of one another to give him a view that is not like the view of anybody else. Now, why do we care about this? We care about this because whoever you are, you're Greek, I'm American, you're straight, I'm gay, blah, blah, it doesn't matter because everyone, I would say, look, everyone feels like they're on the edge in some way, different, special, marginalized, blah, blah, blah. So Cavafy, I think, allows everyone to feel like they have been understood in some way. I think that has a big part of his popular appeal. You know,
I think you're saying this to the right audience. This audience understands very well what it means to say that everyone feels what it means to be on the edge or precarious, especially at this moment.
Yes, right. So I think that, you know, it's just, you know, people always talk about the tone of voice of Cavafy, the personality of Cavafy. You know, it's all true. I think when we talk about Cavafy, it's funny, you know, when you talk about certain poets, you think of certain poems. And I think when you think about Cavafy, quite often you think about a personality. And I don't mean the personality of a person. I mean a group of ideas, a way of seeing things. And I think people feel attached to him because of that, you know.
Recently, you organized an event in New York, and I understand it's there where Orhan Pamuk spoke. He then wrote his text, and he writes something that's very interesting. He says, even though Cavafy makes no explicit reference to himself in his best and most daring work, yet with every poem we read, we cannot help but thinking of him. And you've just done this now. Why this? Why do we go back always to this person, to those photographs, to these moments of life that we don't even know very well?
Well, you know, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a much smarter person. But I think it's interesting. Well, you know, what I do think of when you say that is how many poets I know who you know, Cavafy is the poet's poet. All American poets, Anglo-Saxon poets, everyone knows Cavafy, right? He's teaching people something about their own work, which I think is interesting. But again, I think partly, you know, I want to talk about a quality of Cavafy, which I call the loneliness of Cavafy. And again, I want to make a distinction. I'm talking about a sort of personality. I'm not talking about the man, who seemed to have been quite entertaining and interesting and had interesting friends. But the fact that he's off on his own, doing his own thing, and he really doesn't care about what anyone else is doing. And that, you know, if you're a writer, I think in particular you have great admiration for that, because it's very hard not to care what other people are doing, you know, looking over your shoulder all the time. And I think this is why poets like him, because you always feel when you read Cavafy that he absolutely didn't care what anyone else was doing. He was making these poems that were not like anything else that anybody ever wrote. And he really didn't care. He didn't care if anyone read them, as we know, because if you work on Cavafy, you know, the story of Cavafy's self-publication and it's so unlike any other poet. He doesn't care. He gives his poems to people that he thinks, you know, will appreciate them. That is something that I don't think anyone else I can think of ever did. So he really doesn't care. And so even though we know, or we can imagine, that in his personal life there were disappointments, there were frustrations, blah, 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 there has to be a remarkable kind of strength in a writer who absolutely has no concern for what any other person in his business is doing.
You know,
and that has to give you strength as a writer, but I think it also gives us strength as people when we read him. That's what you feel. I will persist. I may lose the battle, I may not publish the poem, I'll lose the boyfriend, the affair is over, the civilization is ended, but I go on. And how could you not respond to that?
I find this, you know, the amazing thing. He didn't care what the others would say. He didn't care about what was happening in the literary events around him, even though he knew, and he gets information when he wants information. So he doesn't care. But on the other hand, this is a poetry that is very much about caring.
Yeah.
And this is the amazing thing. I mean, this poet who doesn't care, as you said, is also writing these most wonderful poems about caring for the other.
Yeah.
I remember the last poem he published while he was alive is Days of 1908, which for me is the most important poem of caring for the other, not only to touch, to like, to love, to appreciate, but also to tell the other's story.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting part of Cavafy, actually, is what I called Cavafy's ventriloquism. You know, it's very interesting in Cavafy, the way that he speaks for the objects of his admiration quite often, right? You know, there's all these poems that take the, you know, all these poems which take the form of tombstones. You know, there's a very interesting thing that goes on in Cavafy. Who gets to speak? You know, quite often, if it's poems about these handsome young men who have died at a very early age, you know, in a funny way, they only get to speak when they're dead, which I think is rather interesting. But I think you're right. I think that this is on the one hand, he doesn't care what other people are saying, but I mean that in the sense that he doesn't care about literary fashion. You know, the writers he cares about are historians, and that's very important. He has tremendous admiration, respect for historians and the writing of history. And that is why, you know, when he describes himself as a ποιητής ιστορικός, he has tremendous respect for history, and it's a part of him that you have to acknowledge. You know, how does history get written? Who gets to write the history? Is there an alternative version? You know, many of Cavafy's poems depend for their effect precisely on the difference between the official history that you're reading or that somebody wrote and the facts or the history as we know it to have happened. He is deeply aware of the ironies of history, right? That history, as we know, often gets written by the winners. But as we also know, Cavafy is mostly interested in the losers. So already he has a very interesting approach to history. But I would say the writers he does care about are historians. And that's why I think you have to take that very seriously when you read Cavafy.
It seems to me not only does he appreciate historians, but he has his own theory of historiography. He seems to be the poet of historiography rather than history, right?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, it's interesting, and I know because you like this poem so much, how many of Cavafy's poems present themselves as historical inscriptions, historical texts, quotations. Look at Anna Komnene, right? Where you get someone is quoting the text of the Alexiad, whoever, and it says, well, Anna Komnene says, blah, 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 blah. But then the narrator of the poem is saying something quite different. So I don't know of any other poet who is that interested in the tension between history that gets written and maybe there's another story that you're not getting, you know. I would say people always talk about T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot is completely different. It's completely different, you know. So it's interesting.
Why does he go so much back to the ancient periods, the various kind of periods in antiquity, but to the classical, the post-classical, the ancient Greek, Hellenistic period? Is it because he's Greek?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, of course, I would say maybe it's not so much because he's Greek, because, of course, being Greek in the 19th century is already a complicated thing, and he's an Alexandrian. So already it's different. I think it's because he had a deep feeling for Alexandria and a deep feeling for Constantinople. And I think, I mean, I try to imagine as an Alexandrian, and I know we have Alexandrians in the audience tonight, you know, what it must be like to grow up in a city that you know well was the center of the world, and now is at the edge of the world, so to speak. And that gives you an interesting double vision. So when you grow up with that, you see the possibilities of every era of history, right? You realize every place was somebody's center once. And so it makes you alive to the possibilities of, then you start looking at other places, you know, I don't know, Antioch, strange places that most graduate students in history never even heard of. And you think, well, everything was a center once. And I think that double perspective is what makes him interested in history in that way. You know, he's aware that, look, this is the point of, you know, we talked about this, the point of so many Cavafian poems is, and it's both the historical poems, then we'll talk about personal poems too, pospera Santa Chronia, right? That happens to cities and it happens to people.
I find it very interesting that you just said that it's not because of an effort to show stability, but in order to show fluidity, that he goes back to those periods. Yeah. And it's good to underline that sometime. It's not because he feels stable in an identity, not because he feels stable. He wants to show people in stable identities and in stable moments in history, but in fluid moments.
No, I think he's very aware that identity is very fluid, you know, and of course the identity that he's most interested in is what it means to be Greek. But what does it mean? So we can say, oh, the Acropolis, whatever. But he sees the whole picture. He sees the Acropolis, he sees the 3rd century BC, he sees the 2nd century BC, he sees the 1st century BC, he sees the Hellenistic kingdoms falling apart as Rome rises, then he sees Rome fall, then he sees Byzantium rise. So when you have the long view, then what does it mean to be Greek? He sees, most importantly, I think, for Cavafy, he sees paganism yielding to Christianity. And that's why so many of his poems are interested in, you know, who are the real Greeks in the 4th century AD, right? His complete contempt for the Emperor Julian, I think, is an object lesson. You know, Julian thinks he's the real Greek because he wants to go backwards, but the Antiochenes, he really thinks are more Greek. Even though they're now Christian, he thinks they're more Greek than the guy who wants to worship the old gods. That's what's so interesting about Cavafy, it seems to me, is his appreciation of the fluidity and the multiplicity of what Greek identity can mean over 3 millennia. You know, I think that's a wonderful thing.
I think that
I would love to be Greek just because of that. You know?
I think there we very much find ourselves in agreement. There seems to be no identity in Cavafy that's a finished project.
No.
I don't think. Well, not even erotic identity is ever a finished project. But certainly not Greekness, not homosexuality. It seems that identities are there and constantly negotiated. But I don't know if I'm using now a kind of very much contemporary discourse to present something that is much earlier. But
well, but I think it's true. I think it's also true for individual identity in Cavafy, erotic identity. Look, I think I have to imagine that as a homosexual person living when he did, he was all too familiar with the necessity to wear masks. It's interesting, I noticed this, I was teaching a Cavafy seminar just this year, and you know, it's very interesting, his interest in the theater, how often theaters come up in his work, and the sort of the metaphor of the actor, like in King Demetrius.
And performance, right, you know? And performative acts that...
I think that's interesting. You know, he knows what it is to play a role, not always because one wants to, I would say. But this, again, so this provides a personal insight, right? We do this in our lives, but of course it provides him with tremendous historical insight as well. It gives him insight into the way that characters in history have acted. So, you know, in every sense of the word, acted. Yeah.
You said you were teaching for the first time, I understand. You were teaching this year, Cavafy course, right?
Yes. I worked on the translation for 12 years, but I never taught it. And I'm very happy I taught it. Because you learn so much from your students. It's amazing, you know.
Did they tell you anything you had never thought about?
Every week. I taught this course once a week for 2.5 hours, and every week I couldn't wait to get to the classroom because I was the one who was learning. And that's the wonderful, I mean, this is a cliche, but you know, when you teach, because they're reading it maybe for the first time. So they see something that you've been looking at for 12 years, and they say one thing, and you think, oh my God, that completely changed my whole idea. What kids said to me, speaking of days of 1908, right? So at the end of the poem, he's looking, I think, far away at this young man at the beach, this beautiful young man. He's taken off his clothes, he's going for a swim naked at the beach, and he takes off the mended underwear. What's the line?
Well,
and my students, so I've read this poem 1,000 times, and you have the impression when you read the poem that he's, as one often does in one of these Cavafian poems where he's watching, you know, watching a boy walk by.
Do you want the line?
Pardon?
Do you want the line?
Yeah.
No. I'll read it in Greek. I suppose you want the last 5 lines of the poem,
yeah.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Καμιά εβδομάδα ενίοτε πιο πολύ, σαν γλίτωνε από το φρικτό ξενύχτη, δροσίζονταν στα μπάνια, στο κολύμβι το πρωί. Τα ρούχα του είχαν ένα χάλι τρομερό. Μια φορεσιά την ίδια πάντοτε έβαζε, μια φορεσιά πολύ ξεφοριασμένη, κανελιά. Μέρες του καλοκαιριού του 1908. Από το είδωμά σας...
Oh, summer days of 1908. From your perspective, the cinnamon brown suit was tastefully excluded. Your perspective has preserved him as he was when he threw off those unworthy clothes, the mended underwear, and stood stark naked, impeccably handsome, a miracle. His hair uncombed, swept back, his limbs a little tanned from his morning nakedness at the basin on the beach.
And my student says, so how many times have I read this poem, and how long did I... And my student said, you know, you have to get awfully close to see that the underwear is mended.
Yeah.
I never thought of that in my entire life. And I thought, how brilliant is that? You know, it gave me, because you think, you know, you have a sort of cinematic image of this thing, and I thought, that's great. That's why you teach. That's why you teach. Because you're the prisoner of your own brain, and you're so happy, you know. And now, you know, so of course, the other thing that happens when you teach, you want to run back and fix every translation, you know, because you think,
Which will bring me back to translation, because we've already discussed about Cavafy as a poet of time, of difference, of distance, of fluidity, of care, of textuality. And this is the moment where we will discuss Cavafy in translation. And I always was wondering, you know, there must be 5, 6, 7 translations of Cavafy in print at the moment, or have been in print in the last 30 years. Why does someone feel the need to retranslate Cavafy? Why? How did you start? How did you start this project? Translate Cavafy again.
Well, it was, you know, like everything else, an accident, basically. What happened was I had a friend who was a photographer in New York, and he said he wanted to make a series of photographs based on Cavafy. In my experience, that never has a happy ending. But I was, you know, by then I was interested in Cavafy. I was just out of graduate school. I had done my PhD, but I had decided I wanted to be a writer. I had moved to New York, and I was writing and doing journalism. And I thought, oh, this will be so interesting. So this photographer said he didn't like any of the existing translations into English, and he knew that I was interested in Cavafy's. So he said, would you translate 20 poems? And my grandmother used to say, man plans and God laughs. So I, in my naivete, said, oh, this will be so interesting and fun, like doing the crossword puzzle, sort of. And I said, yes, this is an interesting. So I spent some time doing it. And what happened was finally there was, and I already had some ideas about what a translation into English that I would be interested in doing, what were the emphases that I was interested in. Because, of course, there's a wonderful translation already of Mike Keeley, Edmund Keeley, and Ray Dalvin. They were the two in current translations. And so what happened was there was an opening night, a vernissage of the photographs, which we best not talk about, and there was an editor who read my translations, and she's a poetry editor at a publishing house. She used to actually publish as Anne Carson, we were talking about the other night. And she said, oh, there hasn't been a new translation of Cavafy in 30 years, which at that point was true. I took so long to do my translation that by the time it came out, there had been 4 new translations in the intervening years. But I realized, so there were 2 things that happened. Because of the way which I have already explained to you about how I learned Cavafy, which was in the ear, I had a sound in my head that I wanted to try to reproduce in English. There's a cliche about Cavafy that he's prosaic, which I do not find at all in the Greek, which has a strong and wonderful rhythms and many rhymes and many formal devices, all kinds of things. So that was my interest. And I would stress again here, as I always like to do, translations are not in competition with each other. They are in collaboration with each other. I think that's very important. So, when you focus on one thing in a translation, you have to leave out something else. You can't do everything. It's impossible. So if you're interested in rhyme, you're going to lose a little bit of sense, but you have to make a call about what's more important to you. So things like that. Then at a certain point, early on, I thought that for English language readers of Cavafy, precisely because he is interested in history in a way that is unique among important poets, there needed to be a full commentary. People, for several reasons, people today, with the education that people have today, are not nearly as familiar with the ancient world as they once were. Pospera Santa Chronia. And so I thought the historical poems needed to be elucidated fully. Because, quite often in a Cavafian poem, there are about history, let's say, there are so many levels of irony that you need to tease out that unless you know what the history actually was, you sort of don't get the poem, I think. And then, but not just that, because there has been such important scholarly work in the past years that I wanted to sort of synthesize that to some extent. So an American reader of this book could pick up a poem, whether it's a historical poem or a philosophical poem or an erotic poem, and have some sense of where they were. Now, you can read the translation without the commentary, that's fine. But I come out of a philological tradition, and I love the idea of a commentary, So that took a long time. When that's sort of, I think, when I became serious and I understood. And I wanted to present Cavafy in a certain way. So that's why it took so long.
I remember when you were doing that, and there were rumors spreading across campuses, that you were doing the Cavafy translations and that you've translated a new poem, and even I've heard about translations before you ever published them. Like people you had read them to had told me. I remember everybody commenting not so much on the commentary, but that you were preparing, but on the rhythm and the way you were trying to get this across. And I know that many critics appreciated that very much. How much is being lost of Cavafy in a translation? I know it's a cliché question, but more than other poets, less? Is he an easy poet to translate, to get the right message across?
That's a question you should not ask somebody who spent 12 years translating. No, but I know what you mean, of course. I mean, I think, every poet is different. Cavafy, on the one hand, there's, I won't say easy, but there are certain kinds of things you don't have to worry about in Cavafy. There are certain kinds of poetic figures that he's completely uninterested in. Metaphors. I can think of maybe one metaphor in Cavafy. The certain kinds of problems of language. I think the biggest challenge to an English language translator of Cavafy is the katharevusa. We just don't have anything like that. And I think that is really, there is a thing I tried to do, which sometimes I think sort of works better than other times, but we don't have anything like the difference between Dimotiki and Katharevusa. We just don't. And so that's something you lose, basically. I haven't translated any other poets, so I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there are other Greek poets that I read. I personally would never want to have to translate Elitis. I don't even know how people do it. That's a different kind of project.
Well, yet again, another poet, a literary figure in America has done that, Olga Brumas, and she has a personal perspective on Elitis, doesn't she? I don't know.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Olga Brumas has done that in English. She has translated Elitis into English, no? Yeah. I
have nothing but admiration. One of the things that's great about translating, because every translation eventually becomes passé, but I'll tell you the great thing about translating is there is no relationship more intimate than the relationship that you develop with a writer that you love as a translator. It forces you to try to penetrate so deeply, because there are times where you have to imagine, what was he thinking? Which, of course, is a sort of hubristic question. But, you have to go so intimately. And that's, whatever else happens, that's what the translator takes away.
I was at Princeton in 2007, and I remember someone who told me, you had just read your translations in public months before. I went there, and I remember someone over coffee saying, you know what, the last two lines of Entomenia Thir, in Greek go something like, με φαίνεται που ο Λεύκιος μεγάλος θα αγαπήθη, Entomenia Thir, ο Λεύκιος εκοιμήθη. And that student actually remembered your translation over coffee, and he said it out to me. I mean, he said, in love, it seems to me, Lefkios was greatly blessed. In the month of Hathor, Lefkios went to his rest. And, you know that something is happening when people are discussing a translation about to be published. And I think it is something to do with this poet, who drives us all in, who makes us all invested, all talk about this oeuvre, this work with such great interest, personal interest, be it somebody translating Cavafy, somebody publishing a new reading of Cavafy. Everybody seems like very, very anxious to find out more about it and to invest more time in reading those things.
People care.
People care, and it seems to be we go around these words for the right reason. Your translations are the first which include in published form in a book the ατελή ποίηματα, the poems that were found in the Cavafy archive, unfinished, and were then edited and published by Renata Lavanini. So you're the first who have translated those poems. And I have two questions about that. The first question is, what kind of poems are they? They seem to be, some of them, quite different from everything else we know of Cavafy, or not, your view?
Well, I think, one must always begin with the caveat that one is talking about unfinished work. So it's already a problem. Then again, what the word unfinished meant to Cavafis, as we know, there was one poem that, as far as we can tell, he didn't consider finished because he couldn't find the patristic source for the story that he narrates in the poem about the Emperor Julian, the death of the Emperor Julian. So that's one definition of unfinished, which tells you a lot about Cavafy's scrupulousness as a person interested in history. He felt he couldn't release this poem because he couldn't find the original source. Many of them obviously are closer to what we think of as unfinished. There are many drafts, different readings. I mean, these poems, as one would imagine, give us great insight into aspects of Cavafy that we would not have had they not been edited and published. For example, we had a couple of poems about Ioannis Kantekouzenos, but there were more of the unfinished drafts about him. So it turns out that there's a sort of little cycle of poems written about the same time, which I, in my commentary, said was not accidental, that it was during the Greco-Turkish War. And so you begin to, they allow you to understand things about him. There's some more Julian poems. So it fills out your vision. What they would have been had they been finished and published in the form that he finished them, we will never know. But I do think, and because the question arises inevitably about the ethics of publishing unfinished
that would have been the second question.
Work, and this is a personal, I'm not Moses laying down the law for the people. I think in the case of great writers, the great writers they belong to the people, right? They belong to the world. So, if you told me today, right, to use maybe a clarifying analogy, that someone had found 4 unfinished plays of Euripides with a note from Euripides that said, don't publish these plays, right? At a certain point, great literature and great poets, I think that's my own feeling. So, and Cavafy, and I say this as somebody, who understands that Cavafy had extremely strong ideas about which of his poems should be circulated, poems that he considered finished but should not be circulated, So even knowing that, I think that Lavanini, who labored on this, was correct to release them. I think whatever there is, Cavafy is great, and therefore he belongs to the world. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Again, I want to emphasize, this is how I feel about great poets. That's my feeling.
I think more and more now people realize that Cavafy is not only the poet of the 154 poems, it's also the poet who has written other things that were left unpublished, were published afterwards, or were left unfinished. He's also the poet of the constant archiving, the archive, the Cavafy archive, which, let's take it in a much broader sense. It includes from lists to unpublished stuff, from other people writing in, if we take the archive with a capital A, the Cavafy archive is also something that Cavafy very much was in the center of from the beginning. He is somebody who constantly archived his things, who constantly was preoccupied with keeping notes, with keeping even a note of who he sent things to and how.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting part of this very textual body of work.
Yes.
Which I think more and more has come to the center of not only the scholarly reading of Cavafy, but a reading of Cavafy that's much broader and, more people are interested in.
Absolutely. But this is why I think, precisely as you said, because Cavafy himself cared so much. When you look at the atelier, the presentation of the atelier, he
that's the story.
had these sort of, these dossiers with pieces of paper. He was writing poems on cigarette boxes and envelopes, and he kept them so carefully.
And
I think
guys,
for that reason...
If you haven't bought the atelier yet and you go tomorrow and buy them, the story is in the notes, is in the various different drafts, is in the photographs of the notebooks. The story is there. There's a whole story of writing and of spending time and of putting one's life in that project.
Yes, and that's why I believe, and again, this is because I come out of a philological tradition, that the utmost responsibility, I would say, of the archive is to properly organize, catalog, publish the archive. That's the number one priority. It has to be done by serious people, serious scholars. That's, you know this, one knows this so well as a classical. You go to the library, to my beloved former Eleftheroudakis, as I used to go, and you buy this Antigone of Sophocles, and you open it, and you're so happy to be reading the Antigone of Sophocles. What you are reading is the product of the work of invisible philologists who have labored for centuries and decades, taking illegible manuscripts, fragments of papyrus, the erudition that one has to have to do that. So you read the book in Eleftheroudakis, right? But what you're really reading is the work of scholars as well as the work of Sophocles. And that's why I think in the case of Cavafy, like every other great writer, the first priority is establish the text, publish. It's a great thing to have the archive, publish, catalog, let the scholars do their work, because you can't even talk about Cavafy without their work, right? So that, to me, is the most important thing.
And I think everybody's in agreement with that. You said before, teaching Cavafy, we both have had this experience. You always hear new things you never have thought of, even for poems you have been thinking about for such a long time. That reminds to me one such moment in my life. I sometimes teach that poem Κρυμμένα, Hidden Things, to students, and I don't know how many of you know this poem. Is this one that starts, it is a poem that was unpublished during the poet's lifetime, written in 1908, and it starts with «Από όσα έκαμα και από όσα είδα να μην ζητήσουν να βρουν ποιος είμαι και από όσα είπα. Από όσα έκανα και από όσα είπα να μην ζητήσουν να βρουν ποιος είμαι. And it goes on. In the end it says, κάποτε στην τελειωτέρα κοινωνία κανένας άλλος θα βρεθεί, κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα θα βρεθεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. And I have, I think, to repeat that in order to say it, properly. Κάποτε στην τελειωτέρα κοινωνία κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα θα βρεθεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. There was this one student once who was gay, and who said, you know what, you read that phrase and it obviously means at another time, in the more perfect society, there will be somebody else who will certainly appear and act freely. But if you read it in Greek, it says, κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα, βέβαια θα φανεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. Before the line changes, κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα sounds like a shout, a cry. There is nobody else like me. And the boy said, you know what, I have felt like that. And I once read Cavafy. I have felt that there was nobody else like me. And I was lonely, and I had felt that there was nobody else like me. And then the line goes on, and because of the Greek, there's a double negation. Κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα, it means somebody else. Then, when you read the next line. And which brings me to the question that, you know I want to ask, and I feel you may also want to be asked. Have you seen people who have read Cavafy also trying to find out more about a gay perspective, who have come to Cavafy because they are gay, because they feel like that, because they have felt that nobody else was like that, and suddenly they realized this was not the case?
I'm very happy that we finally recognized the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
I had to go round a long circle to get to that.
I am aware that there has been some controversy lately about the extent to which Cavafy's homosexuality ought to be, whatever you want to call it, emphasized, de-emphasized, re-emphasized, overemphasized, whatever. Certainly, there are people, and I know people, who turned to Cavafy because they were gay and they found a kindred spirit. And I just want to open up a tiny little parenthesis here, which is one of these insights that you get for the first. It's very interesting about the poem Krimena, because one of the very few poems in Cavafy that imagines the future.
Yep.
It's very striking. It just sort of hit me, because one is always sort of thinking about the past.
Cavafy as the poet.
To imagine, like, one day there will be. So I think that's so interesting. Certainly, many people I know found Cavafy because they needed to find a voice that was telling a story that was a story that they recognized about being gay desire, frustrated, people meeting in the night and never seeing each other again. Obviously, and I would add here as a personal footnote that although that wasn't quite my story with Cavafy, which you've already heard, it's very difficult in this day and age, which is more open, and there's things on television, and there's things, movies, whatever. Even when I was an adolescent, a gay adolescent, it was impossible to imagine that there was anyone else in the world made like you were, right? So I think that is very important to recognize. And so much of Cavafy's erotic poems are precisely about the phenomenon of sort of people passing and exchanging glances on a stairway and trying to see, is he thinking what I'm thinking? That is certainly part of the project. And
recognition.
Pardon?
Recognition, saying there will be another one like me, and they have to find out.
Or there won't be.
Out.
So I think many people find Cavafy before that. And look, this isn't anything that I haven't made clear in different interviews that I have been giving this week and earlier. To try to read Cavafy, let alone teach Cavafy, while somehow trying to repress this homosexual aspect, is a mad, doomed project. You just can't do it. No writer writes with part of the brain on Tuesday and part of the brain on Wednesday and a different part of the brain on Thursday. All writers write with every part of themselves all the time. And so I want to be very emphatic about that. On the other hand, I'm always yelling at my gay friends in New York because they're only interested in the gay poems. Because I say, because you're not seeing the whole picture, you're not seeing the whole picture either, right? It's like the classicists I know want to read the historical poems. The gay people I know want to read the gay poems. And I think you're all crazy, right? Because you can't separate these things out, especially in Cavafy. And let me say an example. Cavafy has great insight. First of all, as we know, it's interesting that Cavafy is interested in the so-called losers of history, the ones who didn't make it, the ones who were crushed by circumstances, the one who tried to be good and it didn't do them any good, right? I have to imagine that at least in part, his understanding of and sympathy for this type of historical character arose from his own experience as a person who had the life that he had, right? So how can you, I just don't see how you could separate any of these things out.
I agree with that.
And I say the same thing, I say it on both sides. I yell at everybody, It doesn't make sense. So I think everything, if Cavafy were my national poet, I would be the happiest living person. How great to have someone that complicated in an era that is constantly interested in reducing, categorizing, labeling, shelving. Which shelf are you on at Barnes & Noble? Which shelf are you on at Eleftheroudakis? Whatever's left of it, right? That's a question that writers don't think of. That's a question that politicians think of.
You see,
and that's why I think it's incredibly important to understand what I keep referring to as the totality of Cavafy. If you try to separate one thing out, the whole thing falls apart. I feel very strongly about that.
The problem, Danny, is sometimes, can you speak about the totality all the time? And how acceptable is for people to want to speak about aspects because they find them interesting, because they find them less discussed, because they find them politically, at this moment, the things to say. Cavafy is also about those things, isn't he?
No, I totally understand that. And look, everyone reads.
Who can talk
we
about
all
totality,
read people for different reasons. I'm not stupid and I'm not naive, but I've in the past couple of weeks I've been asked some very pointed questions on this subject, and I want to have an opportunity to be clear. My understanding of Cavafy, at least, is that everything is connected. Because in all of us, everything is connected. If somebody were reading my 150 years from now, right? And believe me, it's not going to happen, but when they have the Mendelsohn 150th anniversary, God help me, nothing would make me more unhappy if, someone were saying, well, but you can only read Mendelsohn as a Jewish writer, or you can only read Mendelsohn as a gay writer, or you can only read...
Have you ever heard this said about Cavafy? Is anybody who says that you can only read him as a gay?
No, but I've been asked questions. There's clearly something going on here, right? And people say, oh, well, some of these questions I've been answering. It's like, oh, can you only read Cavafy? I don't even know what that question...
Yeah, why do people are so obsessed with that, you think?
Luckily, I get to fly back to New York on Thursday, and I don't have to...
Oh, it's something that you only get asked here?
No, but I understand that there's some kind of controversy going on, right? Is this too much gay Cavafy, whatever? Look, you know more about this than
I don't know if I do, but I have seen so many journalists this week and the past asking you, and also last year asking you to talk about whether Cavafy is gay literature. And I actually want to know who said this phrase gay literature, and how did they, because there's one thing to give a label and another thing to be able to discuss it analytically. I mean, obviously there are people who want to talk more about homoeroticism, homosexuality as an identity claimed by people in Cavafy's poems. Also homosexuality as something that is constantly negotiated in the Cavafy archive, in the Cavafy output, in the Cavafy canon, and also about people who were gay and read Cavafy throughout the century. And these are people who are poets, who are artists, but also who are people around us who may be here and have this particular affinity in the same way that people read him as a historical poet, or Alexandrians have a special affinity for Cavafy as Alexandrians, and nobody tells them that they are reducing the poet because, for instance, they go and publish a translation, or they fund a project about Cavafy because they are Alexandrians themselves. And nobody say, okay, you're Alexandrian and you want to pick this thing up, but you have to also care about all the other aspects. Who said? And I was, it is as if, you have to speak about gaydom and also castigate gaydom for reading Cavafy as gay. Would you ever castigate like a classicist for putting their own insights in the more classical
no, but I would say that
Cavafy?
No serious person is going to advocate a monochromatic reading of any great writer.
I don't think
right?
that.
I think we all agree on those, and that's why I say people who want to read that way are politicians, not readers. They think in terms of constituencies. They think in terms of who's on one side, who's on the other. I don't think to any serious scholar these are interesting concerns, but I think it needs to be. I would re-emphasize that. Particularly with Cavafy, precisely because he's interested in multiple, complicated, fluid identities, historically, erotically, ethically, certainly, philosophically. You can't pick and choose, right? I think all serious people, agree about that.
Yeah, exactly. There are texts by you, a recent text in the New Yorker, but also one of your best ever texts, The Elusive Embrace, where you talk about your own investment in texts, in times of loneliness, of personal defeat, but also of belief. And there is a beautiful, beautiful piece recently that was in the New Yorker on Mary Renault, where you actually talk about yourself as a young American boy who didn't have anything else to read in order exactly to find out about and consolation about your own sexual identity, and you turned to the classical world of the novels of Mary Renault. And even though I want to apologize somehow for broaching this in the way I did, I think this is the way I mentioned the Cavafy aspect in that respect.
Yes.
There may be other people who read Cavafy in that way.
Yes, there's no question. There's no question.
I mean, we have to somehow.
I think what one wants, what's so interesting to me, and this is a point I make over and over again in my criticism of many different kinds of novels, blah, blah, whatever, is, to my mind, the whole point of literature, art of any kind actually, is to, literature hooks us because we identify with something. But of course, the great trick that literature plays is it hooks you because you identify, and then it shows you something that's totally different, and it makes you feel connected to other things beside yourself, right? So you see what I'm saying? So to my friends who pick up Cavafy because they're gay and he's a gay poet, which is crucial. We all find, it's funny how people always find the writers that they need, like water buffalo smelling water 60 miles away. Somehow you find what you need. I've made this point, as you know, in much of my writing. You know, the trick that literature plays is that we get to see the bigger picture, right? That you may start with an author because you identify with one thing. You know, I'll tell you a story. I had a student once who started a paper, and the first line of the paper was, Madame Bovary is a great novel because it reminds me of something that happened when I was at school. And I wrote, that is not why Madame Bovary is a great novelist, you know. And what's interesting to me, and I worry about this a lot with my students, it's interesting to me, and I notice this more and more, and this may be, you know, a question getting way away from Cavafy about the sort of state of culture, that students, they tell me, oh, I couldn't get into it because I couldn't identify with it. I always think that's so, it never occurred to me to identify with Emma Bovary. You know, I mean, the whole point was that she was not me. But of course, we look for things that we identify with. But I would say, if I were being Platonic, you know, I would say that's level one of the ladder, right? I want to read a book about, you know, when you're, like when I was growing up, you're a boy, you read these Hardy Boy books about boy detectives, right? Because it gets you interested in stories or whatever. So I'm always arguing, and this is true of Cavafy also, that, you know, if you identify him with as a classicist and you want to read the historical poems, great. But hopefully, they'll take you to the other end, and vice versa. I just have to, that's me. You know, that's how I read. And I always say this, I've said this in reviews of many people, you know, the Jewish book that's only interesting to Jewish readers is a good book, but it's not a great book, right? The Greek book that's only interesting to Greek people is a good book, but not a great book. The great book is the book about Greek people that American boys can read, and they'll find something in it. This is how I think about literature. So, but I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying that if you pick up a writer because there's something about the writer you identify, there's somehow that's bad or whatever. But that's the first step. You know, it's the human picture that all great writers are interested in, and that Cavafy is interested in.
Well, I think Cavafy has a lot to say about identification.
Yeah.
But also he keeps alluding to the fact that this is not the end of the story.
No, Cavafy always reminds you that there's always another story, the story that someone didn't get to tell.
You take a side, and then, you take a side, you realize you were on the wrong side.
Right, and Cavafy, of course, knows in the end everyone's wrong.
Yes.
Everyone's wrong. You know, no one has the total picture, right?
In a minute, I'll open to questions from the audience. So you will have to start preparing your question. Θα δώσω το λόγο σε εσάς σε ένα λεπτό για τις ερωτήσεις που ενδεχομένως έχετε. Έχουμε αρκετό χρόνο για τις ερωτήσεις.
I think we have enough time for questions.
Καθώς ετοιμάζετε τις ερωτήσεις σας, θα ρωτήσω...
And as you are preparing for your own questions, allow me to ask one last question, a question which part of the audience has actually asked me to ask to you.
To me by the audience before I open the floor to questions from the audience. And this was something that I also felt reading your masterpiece, according to many critics, that is The Lost. A book.
I thought that my masterpiece was the book I'm writing right now.
Well, let's hope somebody will ask, what is Danny doing right now? Because it's a good story too. But let's go back to The Lost. When I read that, I remember you say a lot there about yourself, searching for your relatives who were lost in the Holocaust. And I said to myself while reading, okay, Cavafy will come up. I can sense, I can feel Cavafy every other page. There is something Cavafian going on. And Cavafy, I think, was not mentioned in the book. I think I even wrote an email to you at the time. And this is the question that a member of the audience also asked me to ask you. How related is your interest in Cavafy to your writing of the lost?
Well, it's funny, I was talking about this the other day, but I think, the whole time I was writing Khamenei, I was working on the Cavafy, and so clearly there was some kind of cross-pollination taking place, and in a nutshell, I would describe it as follows. Look, we were just talking about Cavafy and his personal history, his intellectual interests, and how they pushed him in the direction of being interested in the people that history forgets. That's, I think, maybe one way. Not always, because he writes a lot about people that history remembers, but he's very interested in the problem of forgetting, the ones that get left behind. So, of course, that's what my whole book is about, really. It's how do you... Cavafy understands that so much gets lost in history, and often what we pull back, we think we understand, but we're not quite really getting it. Or maybe the wrong historian triumphs, And I would say, I think by immersing myself so deeply in Cavafy for such a long time, I had a deep appreciation of precisely the way that small lives, ordinary lives, get bulldozed by history, and how important it is and what an ethical imperative it is to try to recuperate lost lives for people who don't get to tell their own story anymore. I think that's right. It's funny because the first poems of Cavafy, interestingly enough, that I had a strong response to were the Taphos poems, because I think it's so poignant, that some people only get to speak when they are dead, and then the only thing that is left of them is what the tombstone says. But of course, the point of so many of Cavafy's poems called Taphos, whoever, is that the reality of the person seems to have been quite richer than what the tombstone is able to tell you, even if they wrote the inscription themselves. So I think I became very wrapped up in this very Cavafyan question of who writes the stories, who tells the stories, whose stories survive, whose stories never get told. And that obviously had a big effect on me. I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't think I was thinking about Cavafy. This is precisely what I was talking about before, right? I thought I was writing with my Jewish head, but it turns out I was writing with my Cavafyan head. That's exactly, I rest my case, right? So I thought I knew what I was doing, and that's why you need the total Mendelsohn picture, right? To understand one book, which is not as great as one poem of Cavafy, right? So you see how that works? We have many aspects, and all of them come into play when we write, and we don't even know about them.
I'll tell you a reader's response to that. When I was reading, there are many moving parts in The Lost, but there is, towards the end, you find out the story of each and every one of the 6 million, or almost all. So you get told the story, you find out about how they died, and you keep persisting to find out exactly how they died, which is part of the book, is that persistence. And towards the end, you want to go in the place where some of them perished, in the place where they were hiding, in the place, to go out there, and you insist, and you persist, and everybody tells you, we cannot find it, or it is there, but then you find out it's not there. But in the end, you go there, in that small cell, or pit, whatever it was, and you want to go in there. And when I was first reading it, I thought, this is un-Cavafyan. He never goes out. He never goes out to do that. But then I thought, you know what? Sometimes he touches a tombstone. Mm-hmm. And sometimes he tries to do with his body whatever remembering there is. Mm-hmm. So there you go, two different readings, and you reaching out, and Cavafy. I found that a great, I don't know, it's a great, I thought it was an un-Cavafyan moment, and then again, perhaps too Cavafyan for me to understand. You know? It has been a discussion I learned so much from, as I have so much from you in our conversations, but also from your texts. I remind you that this was a discussion where we talked about time, Cavafian history, difference, distance, fluidity, care, textuality, sexuality, and now crisis and process. And over these weeks, as Greeks were preparing themselves for your visit, and Greek newspapers had many interviews and columns about you, I sensed this. People do understand your deep engagement with this Cavafy project, as well as your other projects. And I think they have responded to that. As we talked so much about care and process, it was care and process that came time and again in those interviews and in those columns. And it may be one of the characteristics of these poets. I keep saying, you know, a similar thing all evening, but I do believe that he draws us in, and we have appreciated this in you, in your work. I obviously want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank the Στέγη Γραμμάτων και Τεχνών and everyone involved for making this happen, especially Theodoris Chiotis, Aphrodite Panagiotakou, who were very much in it from the beginning. And I have a last favor to ask. As we draw this to a close, would you care to read us a poem? Your favorite Cavafian poem, perhaps, in Greek?
My favorite Cavafy poem is Aptesenia.
Well, would you? Do you want to?
12:30. Γρήγορα πέρασαν η ώρα από τη σενιά που ανάψα τη λάμπα και κάθισα εδώ. Κάθουμουν χωρίς να διαβάζω και χωρίς να μιλώ. Με ποιον να μιλήσω κατάμονος μέσα στο σπίτι αυτό. Το είδωλο του νέου σώματός μου από τη σενιά που ανάψα τη λάμπα ήρθε και με ήβρε και με θύμισε κλειστές κάμαρες αρωματισμένες και περασμένη ειδονή, τη τολμηρή ειδονή. Και επίσης με έφερε στα μάτια μπρος δρόμους που τώρα έγιναν αγνώριστοι. Κέντρα γεμάτα κίνηση που τέλεψαν. Και θέατρα και καφενεία που ήσαν μια φορά. Το είδωλο του νέου σώματός μου ήρθε και με έφερε και τα λυπητερά. Πένθη της οικογένειας, χωρισμοί, αισθήματα δικών μου, αισθήματα των πεθαμένων τόσο λίγο εκτιμηθέντα. 12:30, πως πέρασαν η ώρα. 12:30, πως πέρασαν τα χρόνια.
That was the moment.